Hi everyone, welcome to Chapter 8, Part 2 of our discussion on Congress. You'll see some information at the bottom of this slide that says to text a special code to a particular number. Don't do that because you're watching this as a recording. This slide set is not interactive. It was in class. So again, do not text the code at the bottom to that number at this time. Today, our learning outcomes, we're going to differentiate the types of congressional committees and evaluate the role of each committee system in the legislative process. We'll also identify the congressional leadership structure and assess the rules that influence congressional operations. We'll lastly identify the components of the legislative environment and assess their impact on decision-making in Congress. So let's talk about division of labor among the committees. We know from the first discussion in the first part of this chapter that our founding fathers, when they established our bicameral legislature, the Senate and the House, that they did so that there wouldn't be one house with more power than the other. And that division of labor, the House is responsible for some things, the Senate is responsible for some things, and they work together. The same continues in each one of those legislative areas, the House and the Senate. So they divided the labor among committees then in each one of those. So there are standing committees that are permanent committees that specialize in a particular area. There are joint committees that are made up of members of both the House and the Senate. There are select committees, and those are temporary and created for a very specific purpose, maybe to research a bill further or maybe to look at a particular problem, like we hear a lot about our opioid problem. So there could be a select committee appointed to research the opioid problem if a bill came along that tried to address it. And then conference committees are temporary committees that are created to work out differences between House bills and Senate bills. So if you were with us in class during the first discussion of Chapter 8, the first part of Chapter 8, we did an activity where we had a student who presented a bill, and then we each tagged on something else that we thought, we don't really like that bill, but we'd vote for it if it did this. And so we added those together. At the end, it really wasn't the same bill at all anymore. And so at that point, that would be where a conference committee would come in. It would be good to set up that committee so that members from the House and the Senate could work together to compromise. Also important in the lawmaking process is congressional expertise and seniority. So influence in Congress increases with expertise and seniority, just like it would in the job place. So if you've been working at, let's say, McDonald's, if you've been working at McDonald's for 10 years and you have more experience working there than someone who just started, obviously, then you have seniority. It's the same in Congress. Whoever's been elected for the longest, now those people have seniority. Now, expertise is also important. So although you've been at McDonald's for 10 years, perhaps your job has been taking orders. And if you apply for a job as a cook, someone from another restaurant who has 2 or 3 years of experience as a cook may come in and apply for that job and beat you out of it. And that happened because that person had expertise as a cook. Same thing is true in Congress. So expertise and seniority are important there, just like they are anywhere else. When you talk about committees then, a senior member of a committee that's part of the majority party would become that committee's chairman. Then other senior members in that committee would be subcommittee chairs. And then after that, ranking minority members would follow in too. So in terms of the lawmaking process, the first step in drafting legislation is information gathering. The committee staff would begin research, and then hearings would be held to take testimony from expert witnesses, people with knowledge about the topic of your legislation, whatever your bill is about. The actual debate and amendments on bills in committee happens during markup sessions. And that's when everyone starts working together. And like we did in class during the first example, we started going, well, maybe we should add this to that bill. Maybe we should add this to that amendment. And then committees work hard to find that middle ground to reach consensus on issues that divide the committee members. Okay, now let's move on to oversight. A lot of times when we're talking about oversight, it's a negative thing, right? Oh, I totally forgot to bring the gift to the party. That's an oversight on my part. Well, in this case, oversight is a good thing. It's the following through on legislation. You're double checking everything to make sure everything's right. And legislators and their committees review federal agency operations to determine that the agency is carrying out policies as Congress intended. So that is their oversight of the agency. There are 3 different types of oversight. There are hearings, so you could have a congressional hearing to find out information. There are reports. You might assign a committee to do research and to report on the matter. And there are also informal contacts. Maybe it's just picking up the phone and making a call. Hey, I want to check in on this. How's that progressing? Or an emailed report from time to time, or just touching base to make sure things are going as planned. Okay, also in the lawmaking process, we've talked a lot this semester about the majoritarian and the pluralist views of government. We know that majoritarian refers to governing by the majority. It's an informed public who has input into the decisions. And the pluralist form of government is actually carried out by competing interest groups. In our case, in the United States, those are political parties. And the public then is less informed and less educated about the issues, and they really rely on those competing interest groups or political parties to make the governing decisions. Government by committee vests great power in committees, subcommittees, and their leaders. The committee system actually enhances pluralism since members are elected and seek to represent the interest of their constituency, as long as they do seek to do that. The majoritarian aspect of committees comes through the debates and compromises on bills that are necessary to get a bill passed. So stepping back to the part about how the committee system enhances pluralism, I mentioned as long as the representatives seek to represent their constituency, naturally there's nothing that says they have to, right? Once they get elected, they can make all these promises to represent. And once they get elected, maybe they do, maybe they don't. However, if they don't make that attempt, then people speak with their votes during the next election, and then maybe that person gets replaced. So that's how we still have that voice in our government. Okay, so there are leaders and followers in Congress. And in the majority party leadership, we have the Speaker of the House. And the Speaker of the House is the presiding officer of the House of Representatives. And again, that's the Speaker of the House is chosen from the party that is in the majority. And then the majority leader plans the agenda, and the majority whip enforces party discipline. Now that sounds horrible, right? I mean, they're not breaking arms or cracking knuckles or anything like that. The majority whip is rallying support. That's probably a better way to say it than enforcing party discipline. They're rallying party support or rallying support for issues. And in the minority leadership, you have the minority leader who plans the agenda for the minority party, and the minority whip that rallies support for those minority concerns. And in minority there, I'm talking about the party in the minority. In our case right now, The majority party is the Republican Party. The minority party is the Democratic Party. And the Senate president, it's important to know, is the vice president of the U.S. So Mike Pence right now is the presiding officer of the Senate because he's the vice president of the United States. In his absence, the president pro tem acts as the presiding officer of the Senate. Okay, and in terms of rules of procedure, we have consideration in the Senate requires unanimous consent agreement. Now, that doesn't mean that the Senate must 100% unanimously approve a bill. It's just in order to consider it, in order to discuss it, run it through the process, the Senate requires unanimous agreement in that regard. House bills go to the House Rules Committee before they ever reach the floor for debate. Senate rules allow filibusters, and filibusters are long speeches to kill time. There's no better way to put it. Long speeches specifically just to kill time. And you'd be surprised at how long some of these people can talk. Excuse me, hours and hours and hours sometimes. And then the filibuster can be limited for cloture, C-L-O-T-U-R-E. And that's a procedure that ends the debate, stops it right then, and calls for the vote to be taken. So that's a way to end the filibuster. So decision-making in Congress is affected by political parties, obviously, the president, constituents, and interest groups. We've talked about all of those in depth this semester. Political parties and the president are majoritarian influences on policymaking. And constituents and interest groups are pluralist influences on policymaking. And let me explain those now. We won't wait until we move forward. Political parties and the president are majoritarian influences on policymaking because, excuse me, they rally support for the majority. Whether it's the majority party or the minority party, they're looking for a majority for their legislation. And the president is actively involved in legislation. We will get to that in a minute. Constituents and interest groups are pluralist influences on policymaking. Maybe they're not the most informed people, but they are informed. Excuse me. Sorry about that. This allergy stuff, man. Okay. Anyway, constituents and interest groups are pluralist influences on policymaking because they have that narrow focus, and they're focusing specifically on a narrowed interest instead of an overall picture. Okay. Political parties are strong forces in the legislative process because they affect committee appointments, they affect the consideration of legislators' bills or amendments. They also affect appointments to leadership positions. Parties showcase differences in ideologies and are becoming increasingly polarized and less willing to compromise. We're seeing that a lot more and more these days as rhetoric becomes very, very Republican and very, very Democrat. Very little compromise or bipartisanship these days. So the president, as I mentioned previously, has a lot of input in the legislative environment. Largely that's because of the political process. You know, the president runs for office based on a platform. You know, the president will do this. The promises to do this or that and not to ever do this thing or that thing. So as the president makes those promises, that starts to write the party platform for the party that the president happens to be involved in. So at that point, those promises become key influences in legislation that will be promoted, that will be conducted to fulfill those campaign promises. The White House actually openly gets involved in writing and developing bills, and Congress often clashes with the president, and they get very guarded with their legislative power. And for reason, right? Because our Constitution was set up to have three very distinct branches of government. And when we have the president coming into the legislative environment, those kind of merge a little bit, makes people nervous. So it never fails. There's a clash there, a clash of power from time to time. And, it works out, because the system is set up to do that. And constituents are important too, because people in a legislator's district let their legislator know what they want. And they influence the contribution of pluralism because of the geographic basis of representation. Constituents push and pull Congress in many different directions. Let's say, for example, the state of Arkansas, maybe there's a federal law pending that would raise the minimum wage. And let's say there are people like us who are working, and we could really use that, increase in minimum wage. So we write to our congressman and we say, please raise it. But there are other constituents, maybe who own small businesses, who know that they can't afford to pay their people more. They're paying all that they can right now if they're still going to offer health care. And so then maybe they call the same congressman and say, please, please don't do it, don't do it. And then you have still others who weigh in from different areas too. And, you have a lot of people voicing different opinions to their Congress members. Interest groups also are important in the legislative environment, also an example of pluralist politics. The legislators pay attention to interest groups because they represent the voters. And also lobbyists provide key information, political support, and contributions to those congressmen. So obviously that situation where a congressman is hearing different desires from all sorts of different constituents creates a dilemma. So what happens when constituents want, maybe they don't want the same thing, or when constituents of one state don't want what people across the nation want? So at that point, the congressman needs to decide, are they going to be a trustee or a delegate? And there's a difference between the two. A trustee votes his or her conscience. A delegate votes what the district or state wants. Okay, so let's consider just for a minute a fake bill. Let's say there's a national bill to halt the breeding of pit bulls in the United States based on claims that they're not safe and that funding saved for treating pit bull victims would be substantial. And let's say that this bill comes with several pieces of evidence, like this article that says that victims in the US suffer more than $1 billion in monetary losses every year from dog attacks. And then this one that says pit bulls only account for 88% of disfigurements. And then yet a third piece of evidence that says that America's most dangerous dog breeds are led by the pit bull. Then you have experts come in. You have Caesar and his dog Junior, a pit bull. He's the dog whisperer, and he uses Junior to help gently guide other dogs, sometimes much smaller dogs, into better behavior. And then you have Tia Torres and her Pit Bulls and Parolees special on Animal Planet that shows rehabilitation for pit bulls. And her program also works with parolees to help them rehabilitate and re-enter the job market. Then you have also the Pause in Prison program here in Arkansas that takes pit bulls in, and they're again prisoners who are actually still incarcerated at the time. They're not parolees, but they're still in prison, and they work to rehab these dogs while the dogs are, also rehabbing them. And then you have an article from WebMD that says hey, pit bulls, yes, they can be dangerous, but they're more aggressive to other animals, not humans. Then you have special interest groups, and let's say they voice their opinions. Best Friends has the slogan "Save them all." So they want to save the pit bulls. They don't want this ban on breeding. The American Pit Bull Foundation obviously doesn't want this ban on breeding. However, you have a very powerful lobbyist organization called the National Pit Bull Victim Awareness Organization. And you notice in their logo on the screen, they highlight the word victim for a reason. They want to call your attention to that word. They even highlight the V in the abbreviation so that victim really stands out. So they are very much in favor of legislation in this example, say, for instance, of a bill that would stop the breeding of pit bulls. Then you have your constituents that you're getting cards and emails and calls from, maybe even letters from snail mail. So if you had to vote, would you be a delegate or a trustee in that situation? Would you vote your conscience, or would you vote as your constituents want you to vote? So in terms of pluralism, majoritarianism, and democracy, voting as a delegate supports pluralistic policy making. And that's because policies reflect the bargaining that goes on among lawmakers who speak for the different constituencies. Majoritarian policymaking relies on involvement of the political parties, although voting as a trustee isn't always necessarily 100% majoritarian. It may appear to be, but it isn't always. If you have any questions about Chapter 8, that wraps things up here. If you have any questions, send me an email or catch me after class one day just to let me know you have some questions.